For 5 centuries, Rome governed itself without a king, building a republic that would become the envy and wonder of the ancient world. Yet beneath the marble columns and senate halls, a slow and quiet destruction was already taking root. Ambitious generals discovered that loyal armies could accomplish what persuasion and law could not. Ordinary citizens watched their farms disappear, while the powerful grew richer than any single nation had ever seen. One by one, the unwritten rules that held the Republic together were broken, ignored, and finally forgotten. And when the last crisis came, Romans looked around and realized that the Republic they believed they were defending had already been gone for a very long time. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where ancient worlds awaken beneath quiet narration and the echoes of history drift gently into the night. If you find comfort in stories told slowly, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, though only if this is truly a place you want to return to. And if the mood takes you, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are and what the hour looks like where you sit. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different cities and different time zones are settling into the same story tonight. Before we begin, a question worth carrying into the darkness. If a republic loses its values long before it loses its name, when exactly did it truly end? Now let your shoulders drop. Set aside whatever the day brought you, and allow yourself to drift into the story of the entire story of the fall of the Roman Republic. Chapter 1. The Republic at its peak, Seeds of its own destruction. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over great things before they begin to change. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, of something so vast, so seemingly permanent, that the very air around it holds its breath. That was Rome, somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. A city of marble and memory. A republic of laws and rituals. A civilization that had, over the span of several centuries, built something the ancient world had never quite seen before. And yet, within that magnificence, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the seeds of its own unravelling were already taking root. To understand how a republic falls, one must first understand how it stood. The Roman Republic was not built on the will of a single man, nor on the whims of a king. It was built on something far more intricate, a web of interlocking institutions, traditions, and shared understandings that distributed power among many hands and ensured that no single voice could rise above all others. At the foundation of this system were the popular assemblies. The Centuriate Assembly gathered Roman citizens to elect the senior magistrates, to declare war, and to judge in capital cases. The tribal assembly elected the lower magistrates and passed legislation that shaped daily Roman life. These were the ultimate source of Roman sovereignty, the voice of the people made formal and ceremonial. Above the assemblies, yet answerable to them, stood the magistrates. At the summit were the 2 consuls, elected annually, holding what the Romans called imperium, the supreme authority to command armies, preside over elections and propose laws. That 2 men shared this office simultaneously was no accident. It was a deliberate safeguard, a recognition that unchecked power was dangerous even in capable hands. Below the consuls came the praetors, who administered justice and could command troops, and the quaestors and aediles, who managed finances and public works. Every office was annual. Every office was plural, every office was bounded. Then there were the tribunes of the plebs, 10 officials elected each year whose very persons were declared sacrosanct, untouchable by law. Their most formidable weapon was the veto, a single word, intercessio, that could halt legislation, block senatorial decrees, and bring the machinery of Roman government to a complete stop. They were the guardians of the common people, a permanent check on elite power written into the very structure of Roman governance. Every 5 years, the censors conducted their quiet but profound work. Former senior magistrates who reviewed the census rolls, assessed public morality, managed the composition of the Senate, and oversaw public contracts, they shaped not just the count of citizens, but the character of Roman public life. And then, presiding over all of this with a weight that was felt rather than decreed, sat the Senate, a body of former magistrates lifelong in tenure, wielding no formal legislative power yet shaping the entire direction of Roman civilization. The Senate set foreign policy, managed finances, dispatched envoys, organised the administration of provinces, and issued decrees that, while technically advisory, were almost universally obeyed. Its authority rested not on law, but on something older and more persuasive, on tradition, on precedent, on the accumulated moral weight of centuries. When crises arose that no annual magistrate could handle alone, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single figure granted sweeping authority for no more than 6 months. Even this emergency instrument was bounded, temporal, designed for resolution rather than permanence. The system, in its ideal form, was a masterpiece of balance. But balance, it turns out, is not a thing that sustains itself. It must be maintained, actively and consciously, by the people within it, and that maintenance depended on something the Romans called the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. The mos maiorum was not a written law. It had no single text, no formal enforcement mechanism. It was instead a living inheritance, a set of values, behaviours and expectations passed from generation to generation through example, education, and the quiet social pressure of a community that remembered and revered its past. At its heart lay a constellation of virtues: fides, trustworthiness, the keeping of one's word; pietas, dutiful respect toward the gods, toward family, and toward the state; gravitas, a dignified seriousness that befitted a man of public responsibility; virtus, courage and civic spirit expressed through service to the collective; and perhaps most politically significant, dignitas and auctoritas, the personal honour and moral authority that a Roman earned through years of dedicated public life. These were not merely abstract ideals, they were the invisible constitution of the Republic. They were why a magistrate did not seek immediate re-election. They were why military command was kept separate from civilian politics. They were why a general who crossed certain lines would find himself not just legally challenged, but socially condemned, cut off from the networks of influence and esteem that made Roman political life possible. Because Rome's written laws were sparse, the entire system rested on these shared understandings. When they were honoured, the Republic could flex and adapt, absorbing the stresses of war and growth and internal conflict. When they were violated, when the norms of restraint were abandoned, when political ambition overrode collective duty, the last safeguards against tyranny dissolved. The Republic had no fail-safe beyond the conscience of its citizens, and consciences, history has shown, are among the most fragile of all institutions. For a long time those consciences held, and during that time Rome grew. The period between roughly 264 and 133 before the Common Era is one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of human civilization. In those 130 years, Rome transformed from a regional Italian power into the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. The vehicle for this transformation was war, and the wars Rome fought during this era were among the most consequential ever waged. The 3 Punic Wars against Carthage reshaped the Western Mediterranean. The first, concluding in 241 before the Common Era, gave Rome its first overseas province in Sicily, and within years brought Sardinia and Corsica into Roman hands as well. The second, the great conflict in which the Carthaginian general Hannibal marched his armies through the Alps and spent years devastating the Italian countryside, ended in 201 with Roman victory at Zama. The spoils were immense. Carthaginian territories in Spain were reorganized into Roman provinces, and Rome's grip on the Western Sea tightened. The third and final Punic War ended in 146 with an act of deliberate annihilation. Carthage, the ancient city, the old rival, was razed to the ground, its population enslaved or killed, its very soil, according to later tradition, salted. The province of Africa was born from the ruins. In the east, Rome's legions met and defeated the great Hellenistic kingdoms. Macedonia fell at Cynocephalae in 197, and again at Pydna in 168, becoming a Roman province in 148. That same year, the city of Corinth was sacked, and Greece, the cradle of the civilization Rome so admired, became the province of Achaia. In 133, the kingdom of Pergamon was simply bequeathed to Rome in the will of its last king, and the wealthy province of Asia was added to the growing map of Roman dominion. The Mediterranean had, in the space of a little more than a century, become a Roman see. The Senate managed all of this. It received ambassadors, dispatched generals, allocated provinces, supervised conquered territories, and shaped the distribution of the enormous wealth that conquest brought home. Senators secured lucrative provincial governorships for themselves and their allies. Successful generals returned to Rome laden with spoils, celebrated with triumphs, and reinforced in their political standing. The great families of Rome grew greater still, their land holdings expanding, their client networks deepening, their influence in the Senate compounding with each new victory. And it is here, in this moment of seemingly limitless triumph, that the first quiet fractures appeared. The wars that made Rome great required soldiers. Roman soldiers in that era were not professional warriors paid by the state. They were citizen farmers, men who owned enough property to equip themselves for military service, and who returned when the campaign ended to the land that defined their citizenship, their status, and their livelihood. The property qualification was not incidental. It was the foundation of the Roman military system, and through that, the foundation of Roman civic life. But war demands long absences. A farmer called away for a season might return to find his fields behind. A farmer called away for years, and the wars of this era lasted years, might return to find his land mortgaged, his crops failed, his family in debt. The Roman debt system was unforgiving. Fields fell into disrepair without their owners, livestock deteriorated, seasonal rhythms were broken, and when the veteran finally made his way home, he often found that a wealthier neighbour had purchased his distressed holding, absorbed it into a growing estate, and replaced his family's labour with something cheaper and more tractable: slaves. The conquest of the Mediterranean had flooded Italy with enslaved people. Every sacked city, every defeated army, every razed Carthaginian household sent captives westward to be sold in the markets of Rome and distributed across the Italian countryside. These enslaved workers were cheap. They could not be conscripted. They did not need to leave for campaigns, and they could be driven at a pace that free farmers, constrained by custom and law, were not. The economics were, for a wealthy landowner, irresistible. What emerged were the latifundia, vast estates, often held by senators, equestrians, and the wealthiest of Rome's elite, worked largely by slaves and tenants, specializing in the large-scale production of grain, olive oil, and wine. Much of the land that fed these estates had originally been public land, aia publicus, territory acquired through conquest and notionally held in trust for the Roman people. Over generations, powerful families had come to occupy and then effectively own these public lands, consolidating them into holdings of extraordinary size. As the latifundia spread, small farmers receded, dispossessed, indebted, stripped of the agricultural base that had given them both livelihood and civic standing. Tens of thousands of former citizen soldiers drifted toward the cities, above all toward Rome itself. There, without land, without reliable work, they swelled the ranks of the urban poor, what the Romans called the proletarii, those who could offer the state nothing but their offspring. The consequences rippled through every layer of Roman life. The property qualification for military service, which had always screened out the very poorest, now screened out men who had once been solid, land-owning citizens. The pool of eligible recruits shrank. The military foundation of the Republic, the citizen soldier who fought for the land he owned and returned to it when the war was done, was quietly eroding. And the wealth that should, in theory, have enriched Rome broadly was instead concentrating at the top. The 2nd century before the Common Era saw a dramatic shift in Roman attitudes toward wealth and its relationship to political power. Where an earlier Roman ideal had measured prestige through public service and civic virtue, the new reality measured it through financial outlay. The ambitious aristocrat now financed gladiatorial games of ever-increasing spectacle, hosted banquets of extravagant excess, funded monumental building projects, and maintained vast networks of clients through gifts and patronage. Wealth had become the primary gateway to political visibility. Political competition had become so in part a competition of fortunes. The broader citizenry was not blind to this transformation. Popular awareness of inequality grew. The introduction of secret ballots and anti-bribery courts in this period reflects a society already wrestling with the corrupting effects of money on public life. Traditional families who lacked the means to compete with the wealthiest of the new plutocracy found themselves squeezed from the political arena they had once helped to define. All of this, the dispossession of small farmers, the rise of slave-worked estates, the concentration of wealth, the erosion of military recruitment, the growing chasm between the senatorial elite and the landless poor, was visible long before the crises that would come. The tensions between the conservative senatorial faction, those who would later be called optimates, and the reformist tendency of those who work through the popular assemblies and the tribunate, those who would be called populares, were already shaping Roman political life. The state had ceased its regular program of colonial settlement, which had traditionally provided an outlet for landless citizens and military veterans. Urban unemployment and agitation grew, and the slow fusion of military success with political power, the sense that a great general's glory entitled him to a greater share of civic authority, had already begun to bend the unwritten norms that kept the Republic balanced. The Roman Republic of the 2nd century before the Common Era was, by every outward measure, a civilization at its zenith. Its legions commanded the known world. Its senate guided the fate of nations. Its laws and institutions were the envy of antiquity. And yet, beneath the marble and the ceremony, beneath the triumphs and the senatorial debates, the structures that had made all of this possible were under strain in ways that the Republic's traditions had not prepared it to address. The cracks running through Rome's foundations were invisible at first, buried beneath centuries of tradition and civic pride, but 2 brothers from one of Rome's most distinguished families were about to make those cracks impossible to ignore. Chapter 2: the Gracchi brothers, reform blood and a republic's lost innocence. There is a certain kind of stillness that settles over a civilization just before it begins to change. Not the stillness of peace, but the quieter, heavier kind, the kind that gathers before a storm that no one has yet named. In the middle years of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome carried that stillness within it, even as its armies marched across continents and its wealth poured in from every corner of the known world. And yet beneath the marble and the triumphs, something was quietly breaking. The land that had once sustained Rome's common people was slipping away, not through disaster or drought, but through a slow and steady accumulation, through the hands of those who already held the most. For generations, the state had set aside vast tracts of conquered territory, the Ager Publicus, public land meant to serve the broad body of Roman citizens. Laws existed, old laws stretching back to 367 BCE, that placed strict limits on how much any individual could hold, no more than 500 jugera, roughly 300 acres, of that communal ground. But laws, when left unenforced, and when the powerful find them inconvenient, have a way of fading quietly into the background. By the time Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus came of age, those limits had become little more than distant memory. Wealthy senatorial families had long since extended their holdings far beyond the permitted boundaries, folding great stretches of public land into private latifundia. Sprawling estates work not by free citizens, but by slaves, the human spoils of Rome's many wars. The smallholder farmer, the backbone of Rome's ancient armies, found himself with no ground to stand on, no soil to work, no way to meet the property requirements that would make him eligible for military service. He drifted to the cities, swelling the urban crowds, while his old fields fed the fortunes of men who already had everything. It was into this world that Tiberius and his younger brother Gaius Gracchus were born, and the particular irony of their story is that they were themselves products of that same Roman elite. Their father had been consul twice, a man of great achievement and influence. Their mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the general who had defeated Hannibal. The brothers were educated in rhetoric and Greek philosophy, connected by blood and patronage to the highest rungs of Roman society. They were, by every measure, members of the world they would eventually unsettle. Tiberius became tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE. The tribunate was an ancient office, one created long ago to protect common citizens from the excesses of the powerful, and in the hands of Tiberius Gracchus, it would become something the Republic had not quite seen before. His proposal was straightforward enough on its face. The old land limits would be reinstated and enforced. Any individual holding more than 500 jugera of public land, or 1,000 in the case of unirrigated plots, would be required to return the excess to the state. That land would then be redistributed in smaller parcels to landless citizens, to the poor farmers who had been pushed from the countryside. A commission would oversee the process and ensure fair implementation. To many Romans, this seemed only just. The law already said as much. Tiberius was not inventing a new principle, but attempting to restore an old one. And yet the reaction from the Senate was immediate and fierce. The senatorial families who had occupied public land for generations had long since come to regard it as their own. Their fortunes, their influence, their very way of life were rooted in those fields. They argued that the reform would dispossess them of what they had built, that it would violate property expectations that had hardened into something resembling custom. They argued about the sanctity of the traditional order, about the dangers of populist ambition, about the precedents being set. Tiberius, perhaps sensing that the Senate would never permit his law to pass through normal channels, made a decision that would echo long after his death. He bypassed the Senate entirely and brought his bill directly to the plebeian assembly. In doing so, he stepped outside the unwritten but deeply felt conventions that had long governed Roman political life. The Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors, that quiet compact holding the Republic's institutions in their familiar balance. The Senate had always been consulted first. That was simply how things were done, until suddenly, it was not. The Senate moved quickly to counter him. Their instrument was Marcus Octavius, a fellow tribune who vetoed the agrarian bill at the Senate's urging, using the traditional tribune's power of veto to halt the proceedings. Tiberius found himself stalled, his reform blocked by the very office that was supposed to give voice to the people. What he did next crossed another invisible line. He brought a motion before the assembly to remove Octavius from office, arguing that a tribune who acted against the people's interests was unfit to serve. The assembly passed the measure. Octavius was physically removed from the speaker's platform. No tribune had ever been deposed by popular vote before. The office had been considered sacrosanct, untouchable. Its holders were protected even from physical harm as a matter of ancient tradition. By stripping Octavius of his position, Tiberius had used the mechanisms of the Republic as a weapon against one of the Republic's own guardians, and the precedent, once set, could not be unmade. His land commission was established. The reform moved forward. And then Tiberius made one more fateful decision. He sought a second consecutive tribunate, an act that had no clear precedent and that his enemies immediately framed as the ambition of a man reaching for permanent power. On the Capitoline Hill, in the summer of 133 BCE, the matter was settled not with words or votes but with violence. A mob of senators and their supporters, led by Tiberius's own cousin Scipio Nassicus Serapio, who held the office of Pontifex Maximus, descended on the gathering. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death with clubs and stones, along with hundreds of his followers. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. The killers offered justifications. They spoke of tyrants and the Republic's safety, of customs violated and institutions endangered. But what they had done was something Rome had not done before, not in living memory, not in the way that now mattered. They had murdered a tribune of the plebs for the crime of political inconvenience. For a time, the Land Commission lingered on, its work hampered by the Senate's refusal to fund its operations properly. It was not until the arrival of a royal bequest, the inheritance left to Rome by King Attalus III of Pergamon, that the commission found the resources it needed, and even then, only a portion of Tiberius's vision was realized in those early years. It would fall to the younger brother to carry the torch further. Gaius Gracchus was a different kind of reformer, broader in vision, more systematic in method, and, in the judgment of later historians, more politically sophisticated than his elder brother. He was elected tribune in 123 BCE, and then again the following year, making him one of the few to hold the office consecutively. In those 2 years, he constructed something that resembled not merely a single reform, but an entire platform of interlocking changes. He renewed the agrarian work begun by Tiberius, eventually seeing roughly 3,000 square kilometers of land distributed to poor citizens. He established new colonies across Italy to relieve pressure on the landless poor, and he pushed forward an ambitious colonial scheme that would place a Roman settlement on the former site of Carthage itself, a city Rome had razed to the earth a generation earlier, in what would be called the Colonia Junonia. This plan met fierce resistance. Many Romans regarded Carthaginian ground as cursed, marked by the memory of enmity and the acts of destruction, and conservatives saw in the plan a dangerous extension of populist patronage. But it was perhaps the lex frumentaria, the grain law, that left the deepest mark. Gaius required the state to purchase and distribute grain to every Roman citizen at a fixed, subsidized price, roughly half what an ordinary labourer might earn in a day. For the urban poor, this was transformative. For the first time, the Republic formally acknowledged that it owed material support to its citizens. The political implications were no less significant. A body of citizens who depended on the state's grain was a body of citizens with a very clear interest in seeing that the tribune who had created the system remained in power. Gaius had constructed, quite deliberately, a permanent constituency. He transferred control of the juries that tried senatorial corruption cases from the Senate to the equestrian class, the wealthy merchants and businessmen who occupied the rung just below the senatorial elite, thereby limiting the Senate's ability to protect its own members from accountability. He oversaw road-building projects and public works. He set minimum age requirements for military conscription, easing the burden on the young. And then he proposed extending Roman citizenship to the Latin allies, and offering lesser but meaningful rights to the broader Italian peoples who had fought in Rome's legions for generations without sharing in the political life of the city they served. This last proposal destroyed him. The urban poor, who had been his most loyal supporters, turned against him, fearing that sharing the citizenship would dilute their grain allocations, their voting power, their privilege. The senators, who had always opposed him, now had the people on their side. His political position crumbled. In 121 BCE, the Senate passed a measure that had no precise precedent, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a declaration of emergency that granted the consuls the authority to act by any means necessary to preserve the state. It was a constitutional weapon forged in the heat of crisis, and it was aimed at Gaius Gracchus and his supporters. Gaius fled. When capture became inevitable, he took his own life rather than face what awaited him. The violence that followed was systematic. Thousands of his supporters were killed or imprisoned without trial. The instrument that had been used to justify this, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, would not be the last time Rome reached for emergency powers to silence those who challenged its traditional order. In the centuries that followed, historians and scholars would return again and again to the question of what the Gracchi had truly been. Sincere reformers driven by genuine concern for Rome's dispossessed citizens. Ambitious politicians who understood that the people properly organised could become an irresistible political force. Most who have studied them carefully have concluded that they were, in truth, both at once. Men of real conviction who also understood with clear eyes the uses of power and the mechanics of popular support. What is harder to dispute is what they left behind. They had shown that a tribune could bypass the Senate and legislate directly through the assembly. They had shown that land, grain, and citizenship could be wielded as political instruments. They had shown that violence, when exercised in the name of tradition, could be made to seem like order, and that the same violence, when met in kind, could produce not resolution, but escalation. The Land Commission eventually distributed its parcels. The grain dole endured and evolved. The precedents accumulated quietly, like sediment on the floor of a slow-moving river. The blood of the Gracchi had not saved the Republic's old order, but had instead opened a door through which far more dangerous ambitions would eventually walk, and from the chaos they left behind, a new kind of Roman man was about to emerge. Chapter 3. Marius and Sulla. The Republic turns its swords on itself. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a civilization just before it begins to tear itself apart. Not a violent silence, but a deep and uneasy one, like the stillness before a long approaching storm finally arrives. Rome knew that silence in the final decades of its republic, and at the centre of that gathering darkness stood two men whose names would echo through centuries: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Gaius Marius was born around 157 BC in the modest village of Seriate near Arpinum, to a family of equestrian standing but no great senatorial lineage. In a republic where the highest offices of state had for generations been passed between a small circle of patrician families, a man like Marius was not supposed to rise very far. He was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach the Senate. That alone was remarkable. What followed was extraordinary. His early career brought him to the tribuneship of the plebs in 119 BC, where he passed legislation aimed at curbing the ability of wealthy elites to interfere in elections. It was a quiet signal of what was to come. Marius had no old family name to carry him forward. He would rely instead on something far less delicate: military victory and the devotion of the men who fought under him. The opportunity came first in the Jugurthine War, a conflict that had dragged on since 111 BC against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia in North Africa. Jugurtha was a man of extraordinary cunning. He had seized his throne through treachery, eliminating his co-heirs one by one, and then he had discovered something perhaps more useful than battlefield skill: the price of Roman officials. Senator after senator, commander after commander, had been persuaded through quiet payments to overlook Jugurtha's climes, to grant favourable settlements, to look away. The Roman public, watching this spectacle of corruption unfold, grew deeply disillusioned with the senatorial aristocracy that was supposed to represent them. Populist politicians seized upon the scandal. Among them was Marius, who manoeuvred his way into the command of the war and sailed for Africa. He seized key towns, pressed into hostile territory, and ultimately cornered the elusive Numidian king. The final capture of Jugurtha involved diplomatic negotiations handled in part by a young officer on Marius's staff, a patrician named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, though it was Marius who received the garlands of triumph. The war was over. Marius came home a celebrated man, but an even greater trial awaited. In the decades before, Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones joined by Celtic allies, had swept down from the north and west, crossing into Roman territory and destroying one Roman army after another. The defeat at Arausio had been catastrophic. Rome trembled. The memory of Hannibal, of that ancient existential dread, was stirring again. The Republic turned to Marius. He was elected consul repeatedly, from 104 to 100 BC, an unprecedented concentration of power in a single man. And Marius did not merely win the coming battles, he remade the army itself. Before his reforms, Roman soldiers had been required to own property above a certain value. The legions were, in essence, a militia of landowners. Marius swept that requirement away. He opened the ranks to the landless poor, the capitacensi, those counted by Rome only as bodies rather than by wealth. He standardized equipment, supplying weapons and armor from the state's stores rather than requiring each man to outfit himself. He reorganized the tactical structure, making the cohort rather than the old maniple the basic fighting unit. And the eagle, the aquila, became the sacred symbol of each legion, a standard around which men gathered their identity and pride. These were not merely military changes, they were a quiet revolution in the relationship between soldier and state. A landless man who had built his life around his legion for 16 years owed his livelihood, his future land grant, and his very sense of self to the general who had raised him and led him, the army's loyalty, slowly but irreversibly, was tilting away from the distant abstraction of the Roman Republic and toward the living, present figure of the commander. Marius used his rebuilt legions to devastating effect. At Aquae Sextiae, the Teutones were defeated and their numbers vastly reduced. At Vercellae, the Cimbri met the same fate. Tens of thousands fell. The threat that had haunted Rome for years was extinguished. Marius returned to the city as its saviour, celebrated as a third founder of Rome, standing alongside Romulus and Camillus in the gratitude of the people. Meanwhile, the young officer who had helped capture Jugurtha was quietly building a career of his own. Lucius Cornelius Sulla came from an old but impoverished branch of the patrician gens Cornelia. His family carried the weight of an ancient name without the wealth to sustain it. Inheritances from a stepmother and a wealthy mistress eventually provided the financial foundation he needed for political life, and he had entered public service as a quaestor assigned to Marius's African campaign in 108. Sulla was a man of contradictions, educated, elegant, fond of the theatre and the company of actors, yet capable of extraordinary brutality when it served him. He rose through the ranks steadily, praetor, governor of Cilicia, where he restored a friendly king to his throne and made Rome's first diplomatic contact with the distant Parthian Empire. He was in many ways the embodiment of the old aristocratic ideal: patrician lineage, classical learning, a belief in the Senate's supremacy, and a cold confidence in his own right to lead. The two men found themselves fighting side by side once more during the social war of 91 to 87 BC, a conflict that shook the Republic to its foundations. Rome's Italian allies, the Socii, had long fought in Rome's legions, supplied her armies and endured her wars, yet they remained excluded from Roman citizenship and the rights it carried. After decades of grievance, they revolted. The war that followed was devastating. Marius served as a legate in the north, helping to stabilize the early fighting. Sulla led decisive campaigns in the south, ultimately securing Roman control after the death of his superior. Both men emerged from the war with enhanced reputations. Rome, for its part, eventually granted citizenship to most of the Italian peoples, conceding much of what the rebellion had demanded. Then came the Eastern question, and with it, the breaking point. Mithridates VI, the king of Pontus on the southern coast of the Black Sea, had built a formidable empire across Asia Minor and drawn large portions of Greece into his influence. In 88 BC, his forces had swept through the Roman province of Asia, killing thousands of Roman and Italian settlers in a coordinated massacre. The threat to Roman power in the east was grave and undeniable. The Senate assigned the command against Mithridates to Sulla, who had just been elected consul, and stood ready to lead his legions east. It was the plum of all commands. Glory, wealth, and power awaited in the east. But the tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus, allied with Marius, brought the matter before the popular assembly, which voted to transfer the command to the aging but still ambitious Marius. Sulla's response crossed a line that had never before been crossed in quite so stark a fashion. He marched his legions on Rome. The taboo was profound. The Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, was a threshold no Roman commander was supposed to cross with his army under arms. It was a line that separated military power from civil life, the world of conquest from the world of law. Sulla stepped over it. Most of his officers followed, though some deserted, unable to accept what they were being asked to do. Marius and his allies tried to resist, but without legions of their own to match Sulla's veterans, resistance collapsed. Marius fled, slipping out of the city under pursuit, hiding in marshes near Minturnae, narrowly escaping when those sent to kill him reportedly lost their nerve. He crossed the sea into exile in North Africa, finding shelter near the ruins of Carthage, a fallen empire, a fitting refuge for a man who had once seemed invincible. Sulla remained in Rome long enough to declare Marius and his allies enemies of the state. Then he turned his army around and marched east toward Mithridates and the wars he had been promised. What happened in Rome while Sulla was away illustrates how thoroughly the old constitutional safeguards had already been hollowed out. Marius's ally Lucius Cornelius Cinna gathered forces among Italian communities and veterans. He and Marius blockaded the city, cut off its food supply, and compelled the Senate to surrender in late 87 BC. Marius, the exile, the man declared an enemy of the state, was elected consul for the 7th time. The two men then carried out a brutal purge, executions, forced exiles, confiscations. The consul Octavius and the orator Marcus Antonius were among those who did not survive. Marius himself died in January of 86 BC, just 17 days into his 7th consulship. He had spent his final years driven by a relentless, consuming energy, even as his body failed. He left behind a Rome that bore the marks of everything he had made possible, both the professional army that would one day conquer the known world and the precedent that soldiers could be turned against the city itself. Sulla, meanwhile, was winning his own war. He entered Greece, besieged Athens and the Piraeus, then destroyed Mithridatic armies at Chaeronea and Orchomenus. He crossed into Asia Minor, compelled Mithridates to accept a peace treaty at Dardanus in 84 BC, and secured his eastern victories before turning his gaze back toward Italy. In 83 BC, Sulla crossed the Adriatic with 5 battle-hardened legions. He landed in the south and marched north. He defeated the consular army of Gaius Norbanus at Canusium. He forced the capitulation of another army whose soldiers, confronted by Sullan veterans, defected in large numbers. He swept through the peninsula, crushing Marian forces at the Battle of Sacriportus, and then, in 82 BC, at the decisive Battle of the Colline Gate, fought at the very walls of Rome, where the Marian levies were broken and the city fell into Sulla's hands for the 2nd time. What followed was systematic and cold. Sulla produced lists, the proscriptions, names were posted in public spaces. Anyone whose name appeared was condemned without trial. Their property was forfeit to the state. Their children and grandchildren were stripped of citizenship and barred from public office. Anyone who killed a proscribed man received a reward. Anyone who sheltered one risked their own life. The lists began with roughly 80 names and quickly expanded to several hundred, with ancient sources suggesting the total roster eventually reached around 520 individuals. Modern estimates place the number actually executed somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000. The violence was both revenge and policy, a means to destroy the Marian faction, intimidate all remaining opposition, and redistribute confiscated wealth to Sulla's supporters. And then Sulla did something perhaps more remarkable than any of his military campaigns. He reformed the Republic's constitution. As dictator, he doubled the Senate's membership from roughly 300 to 600, filling the new seats with men drawn from the equestrian order and from his own allies. He restored senatorial control over the law courts. He formalized the cursus honorum, the sequence of offices a Roman politician was expected to hold, setting strict prerequisites and limits on consecutive office holding. He restricted governors, preventing them from remaining in their provinces beyond a fixed term, and he stripped the tribunate of much of its power, requiring Senate approval for any legislation a tribune wished to introduce and removing the tribune's veto. Sulla was trying to put the Republic back together, to restore the world of senatorial supremacy that he believed had been the proper foundation of Roman governance. And then, having done all of this, he resigned. In 79 BC, Sulla stepped down from the dictatorship and retired to private life. He had pledged that his powers were temporary, held only until the constitutional work was done, and he honoured that pledge. He spent his remaining time writing his memoirs. He died the following year, 78 BC, on his country estate. Historians have long wondered what to make of Sulla. He was a man who marched on Rome twice, killed thousands through proscription, and ruled as dictator, yet who also genuinely believed he was saving the Republic rather than destroying it. His resignation seems to say that he meant what he claimed, that extraordinary measures had been justified by extraordinary circumstances, and that once those circumstances had passed, power must be laid down. But the lesson that Rome took from his career was not the resignation. It was the march. It was the proscription lists. It was the proof that a general with loyal veterans and sufficient will could override every law, every tradition, every ancient boundary the Republic had drawn around itself. Sulla had shown that the Republic's rules could be rewritten at sword point, and the generation that grew up in the shadow of his dictatorship had watched and learned, among them 3 men whose personal ambitions would now reshape the entire Roman world. Chapter 4: Caesar, Pompey and Crassus, the triumvirate that swallowed the Republic. There is a particular quality to the silence before great things change forever, a stillness in the air, as if the world itself is drawing breath. And in the decades before Rome became something entirely different from what it had always been, that silence gathered slowly, patiently, like water collecting behind a dam that was already beginning to crack. It began, as so many profound shifts do, not with armies or declarations, but with 3 men sitting together in quiet rooms, speaking of what each of them needed and what each of them could offer. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was born in 106 BC into a world that rewarded the bold. He had learned early that ambition and military success were the twin keys that unlocked everything Rome had to offer. As a young protege of the dictator Sulla, he raised his own legion from his home territory of Picenum, joined Sulla's forces during the civil conflict of 83 to 81 BC, and was dispatched to recover the provinces of Sicily and Africa from those who opposed the new order. He performed so brilliantly that Sulla granted him the right to a triumph, and with it came the honorific that would follow him the rest of his life: Magnus the Great. But Pompey's greatness did not rest on a single campaign. It accumulated, conquest by conquest, over many years. In 67 BC, the Roman Senate faced a crisis that had grown beyond their ability to manage. Pirates, centred in the rough coastlines of Cilicia, had grown so numerous and so bold that they threatened the very grain supply upon which Rome depended. Trade was strangled, merchant ships disappeared, even Roman citizens had been taken as slaves. The solution the Senate reached for was extraordinary. Through a special law known as the Lex Gabinia, Pompey was granted proconsular authority over the entire Mediterranean Sea and the coastal regions extending roughly 70 kilometers inland. He could raise a fleet of somewhere between 270 and 500 warships, command an army of approximately 120,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry, and appoint up to 25 senior officers to manage separate maritime zones. The resources granted to him were staggering. The authority placed in his hands was unlike anything Rome had extended to a single man before, and Pompey used it with devastating precision. Dividing the sea into operational districts, he swept the pirates systematically from west to east, subduing them from the coasts of Spain and Italy, all the way to Crete, Cilicia, and the Aegean. Within a matter of months, the Mediterranean was quiet again. It was a feat of logistics and a military organisation that left Rome speechless with admiration. But even this was not enough to define Pompey's legacy. What followed in the East would be remembered for generations. In the Third Mithridatic War, he defeated King Mithridates VI, the long-standing enemy of Rome, who had haunted Roman ambitions in Asia Minor for decades. He subdued Armenia. He secured the Black Sea frontier. He marched into Jerusalem. And in the wake of all this, he undertook the enormous task of reshaping the Eastern Mediterranean into a Roman-controlled world. He enlarged existing provinces, created new ones, Bithynia Pontus in the north, Cilicia in the south, Syria in the Levant, and established a network of client kingdoms designed to buffer Roman territory from the powerful Parthian Empire to the east. He reformed taxation, settled former pirates as inland farmers, founded and refounded cities, and imposed a coherent legal and administrative framework that would endure for centuries. It was not merely conquest, it was the architecture of empire. When Pompey returned to Rome, he was the most celebrated man in the Republic. He was also, in certain ways, dangerously vulnerable. His eastern settlements required Senate ratification. His veterans required land, and the Senate, wary of his power, was slow to cooperate. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Born around 115 BC, Crassus had built his influence not through battlefield glory but through the quieter, more pervasive power of money. During the proscriptions and instability that followed Sulla's rise, he'd accumulated enormous wealth by purchasing confiscated and fire-damaged properties at near-worthless prices. He employed a private fire brigade that would arrive at burning buildings and refuse to act until the desperate owner agreed to sell at Crassus's price. He invested in slaves, in mining ventures, in the lucrative tax farming contracts that ran like arteries through the Republic's financial body. From a modest inheritance, he built a fortune estimated at several hundred million sesterces, making him the wealthiest private citizen in Rome's history. Crassus's money bought him political influence of an almost incalculable kind. He funded elections, supported candidates, secured consulships, and built patronage networks that extended through every layer of Roman society. He'd even commanded the army that crushed the great slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, achievement that added military prestige to his financial dominance. But what Crassus truly wanted, what he felt he still lacked, was the kind of luminous military glory that Pompey wore so naturally. That hunger would eventually destroy him. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar. Born in July of 100 BC to a patrician family of modest means, Caesar carried in his blood a connection to one of Rome's great generals. His aunt Julia had been married to Gaius Marius, the celebrated reformer of the Roman army and hero of the wars against Jugurtha and the Germanic tribes. This family connection placed Caesar in the Marian political tradition, which meant that when Sulla seized power in 82 BC and ordered him to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of a Marian ally, Caesar refused. He fled into hiding rather than comply. He was eventually pardoned, but the confrontation established something essential about his character. He did not yield easily to pressure, and he understood that political survival often required both audacity and patience. Caesar served in the army, earning the civic crown at the siege of Mytilene in 81 BC. While sailing to Rhodes in 75 BC, he was captured by Cilician pirates who demanded a ransom. Caesar, reportedly finding their initial price insultingly low, suggested they double it. He paid the 50 talents they eventually demanded, then immediately raised a fleet, captured his former captors and had them executed. The story, whether polished by later retelling or not, speaks to a man who did not experience the world as something that happened to him. His early political career was built methodically. Military tribune in 71 BC, quaestor in Hispania Ulteria in 69 BC, which granted him a seat in the Senate. Aedile in 65 BC, where he staged games of such spectacular generosity, financed largely through debts he had accumulated from the wealthy Crassus, that the Roman people could not forget his name. Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC, Praetor in 62 BC, and finally Consul in 59 BC, each step deliberate, each step building towards something larger. By the year 60 BC, all three of these men, Pompey the celebrated conqueror, Crassus the indispensable financier, Caesar the rising populist with the consulship in his grasp, recognized that they each possessed something the others needed, and that together they could accomplish what none of them could achieve alone. Pompey needed someone with legislative skill and consular authority to push through the ratification of his eastern settlements and secure land for his veterans. Crassus needed political allies to protect his financial interests, particularly for the tax farmers who had suffered losses in Asia and who were looking to him for relief. Caesar needed Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's money to clear his debts and fund his campaigns, and the support of both men to survive the opposition he was certain to face. The arrangement they came to was private, informal. There was no law creating it, no magistracy defining it, no public announcement marking its formation. It was, in the language of the time, a friendship, though contemporaries sometimes called it a conspiracy. The word triumvirate itself did not exist in ancient Rome. It is a term applied later by historians to describe what was, in its day, simply three powerful men agreeing to help each other. But the effects of that private agreement were anything but informal. In 59 BC, as consul, Caesar pushed through a series of laws that served all three partners. An agrarian law distributed public land to Pompey's veterans. A vote ratified Pompey's eastern settlements, providing the legal foundation they required. Tax reforms protected Crassus's financial interests, and through the Lex Vitinia, Caesar himself secured a proconsular command over Gallia Cisalpina and Gallia Narbonensis, a posting that would give him his own legions, his own conquests, and the military reputation he still needed to complete his ascent. Elections were manipulated. Votes were bought. Pompey's veteran soldiers were deployed as quiet, looming reminders of where real power resided when the Senate considered resistance. The machinery of the Republic still turned, its gears still moved, but the hands guiding it were no longer those of the Senate alone. For years the arrangement held, but alliances built on mutual need are never entirely stable, and the forces that strained this one had already begun working from the moment it was formed. Caesar rode north into Gaul, and there, over the span of 8 years from 58 to 50 BC, he conducted one of the most consequential military campaigns in the ancient world's history. Gaul, the vast stretch of territory encompassing roughly what is now France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland and parts of Germany, became the stage on which Caesar transformed himself from a promising politician into something approaching a legend. The campaigns began in 58 BC when Caesar intercepted the migrating Helvetii and defeated them at the Battle of Bibracte, then turned against the Germanic Suebi under their leader Ariovistus in the same year. In 57 BC, he swept through the lands of the Belgae in the north, most famously engaging the fierce Nervii at the Battle of the Sabis, in a struggle so fierce that Caesar himself later recalled it as one of the most desperate his legions ever fought. The Attuatuci were besieged and overcome. The Aedui were secured as allies. In 56 BC, a combined land and sea operation crushed the maritime Venetii on the Atlantic coast. In 55 and 54 BC, Caesar launched 2 expeditions across the Channel into Britain. The first a probing raid, the second a larger incursion that forced several tribal surrenders, though neither expedition established permanent Roman control over the island. The winters of 54 and 53 BC brought revolt in the northeast, as the Eburones under the chieftain Ambiorix struck at Roman forces with devastating effect, annihilating entire cohorts before Caesar's brutal counteroffensives suppressed the uprising. But the true climax came in 52 BC, when a young noble of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix did something no Gallic leader had managed before. He united many of the diverse Gallic peoples, the Arverni, the Aedui, the Carnutes, the Bituriges and others, under a single coordinated command. Vercingetorix had been exiled by those of his tribe who feared his ambitions, but when the revolt gathered force in early 52 BC, he was elected as its commander. He understood that fighting Rome in open battle was unlikely to succeed. Instead, he adopted a scorched earth strategy, denying Caesar's legions the food and resources they needed to sustain themselves. The strategy worked, to a point. At Gergovia, the fortified heights of the Arverni capital, Vercingetorix inflicted a genuine tactical defeat on Caesar, one of the few times in the Gallic wars that the Roman forces were turned back. It was a moment that rippled through Gaul, encouraging more tribes to join the resistance. But the decisive encounter came at Alesia, where Vercingetorix withdrew with an army of roughly 80,000 warriors to the strongly fortified hilltop town. Caesar's legions, approximately 60,000 men, encircled the position entirely, building an inner ring of earthworks, the circumvallation, to contain the defenders, and an outer ring, the contravallation, to protect against a relief army. That relief army came, enormous in number, perhaps as many as 250,000 by ancient accounts. For days the Roman forces held their double lines against simultaneous attacks from within and without. In the end, it was not enough. The relief army was repulsed. The defenders of Alesia faced starvation. Vercingetorix, who had unified Gaul's resistance more completely than anyone before him, rode out of the gates and surrendered. He was taken to Rome, held prisoner for 6 years, displayed in Caesar's triumphal procession in 46 BC, and then executed. The defeat at Alesia broke the organised resistance of Gaul. Scattered fighting continued at places like Uxellodunum in 51 BC, but by 50 BC, Gaul was Roman. These years in Gaul did more than extend Roman territory. They transformed Caesar himself. The massive booty, gold, silver, slaves and confiscated property, flowed from the conquered lands into the Roman treasury and in considerable portion into Caesar's own war chest. He cleared his debts. He accumulated enormous personal wealth. He funded political allies back in Rome, and through his own written account of the wars, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, he shaped how Rome perceived him. Written in a precise, deceptively simple style, the commentaries presented his campaigns as swift, decisive and morally justified, the defense of Roman interests by a capable and selfless commander. Enemy numbers were sometimes inflated. Victories were made to seem effortless. Caesar himself was portrayed as a man of discipline and reason, protecting the Republic rather than aggrandizing himself. It was among the most successful pieces of political writing the ancient world ever produced, and the soldiers who fought beside him through 8 years of forest, river, mountain and siege, they became something more than an army. They became his, The systematic sharing of plunder, the personal presence he maintained among them, the shared suffering of campaigns that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine and across the Channel, all of this forged a bond between Caesar and his legions that would prove in the years to come far more consequential than any senatorial decree. While Caesar built his power in the north, the foundations of the Triumvirate were quietly eroding. In 56 BC, the three partners had met at the town of Lucca in Cisalpine Gaul to renegotiate their arrangement. The original pact was showing its age. Caesar's spectacular victories were shifting the balance of prestige. Pompey felt his influence slipping. Crassus feared being left behind. At Lucca, they agreed to fresh terms. Pompey and Crassus would run together for the consulship of 55 BC, after which Pompey would receive the Spanish provinces and Crassus the rich eastern province of Syria. Caesar's proconsular command in Gaul would be extended by 5 years, and with it, the legal protection he needed to avoid prosecution for actions taken during his earlier consulship. It was a workable arrangement, but arrangements require the people who made them to remain alive. Crassus, having secured Syria, embarked on the eastern campaign he had long dreamed of, a war against Parthia that he hoped would earn him the military glory to match his wealth. Ignoring advice to advance through the safer mountainous terrain of Armenia, he led an army of roughly 7 legions into the open desert of Mesopotamia in the spring of 53 BC. Near the town of Carrhae, the Parthian general Surena met him with forces built around horse archers and heavily armoured cataphracts. The Roman formations, accustomed to close-quarters combat, had no effective response to the clouds of arrows that poured down on them hour after hour. The cavalry that might have closed the distance was driven back. The infantry could not advance. Crassus's son led a charge and was killed. What followed was a disaster without precedent since Hannibal's victory at Cannae. Approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed. 10,000 more were taken prisoner, and Crassus himself, drawn into negotiations under a flag of truce, was killed treacherously during a parley. Ancient accounts, coloured by a certain grim symbolism, claimed that molten gold was poured into his dead mouth, a final commentary on the greed that had driven him to the desert. The death of Crassus removed the third pillar of the Triumvirate. There was no longer a balancing force between Caesar and Pompey, no wealthy mediator to smooth the frictions that had always run beneath their partnership, and those frictions were already deepening. In 54 BC, Julia, Caesar's daughter, whom Pompey had married as part of the original alliance, died in childbirth, along with her newborn child. The marriage had been more than a political convenience. It had created a genuine familial bond, a personal connection that gave both men a reason beyond calculation to preserve their relationship. When Julia died, that connection died with her. Pompey soon married Cornelia Metella, daughter of a conservative senatorial family, a choice that drew him steadily toward the very faction that was most determined to curb Caesar's power. Through the late 50s BC, the Senate's opposition to Caesar hardened. The Gallic campaigns were winding down. His command was expiring. His enemies, most vocal among them the austere Cato the Younger and the eloquent Cicero, argued that Caesar should relinquish his provinces, disband his legions, and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar's position was constitutionally delicate. A law passed by the 10 tribunes in 52 BC had granted him the right to stand for the consulship while absent from Rome, a protection that would allow him to seek office without first surrendering his command. But his opponents challenged this, insisting that Roman law required a magistrate to lay down his military authority before seeking election. The stakes of this argument were not merely procedural. Without his command and his legions, Caesar would arrive in Rome exposed to immediate prosecution for his actions as consul in 59 BC and as proconsul in Gaul. His political enemies had made clear they intended exactly that outcome. The consulship was not merely an ambition for Caesar, it was a shield. His allies in Rome, particularly the tribune Curio, and later Mark Antony, used every legal tool available to block the Senate's attempts to strip Caesar of his command. In 50 BC, a Senate motion demanding that both Caesar and Pompey simultaneously lay down their armies, a compromise that would have preserved some semblance of balance, was narrowly defeated. Pompey refused to accept such a condition. The Senate, now dominated by Caesar's opponents, passed its final decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which effectively declared Caesar an enemy of the state and called on all magistrates to defend the Republic against him. By January of 49 BC, the moment of decision had arrived. To the north of Rome, there was a small river. Modest in size, unremarkable in appearance, it ran through the landscape of northern Italy with no particular grandeur. But this river, the Rubicon, marked the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and the Italian heartland of the Republic. Under Roman law, a commander who crossed this line with a standing army committed an act of war. The legions of Rome were instruments of the state's foreign policy, and bringing them onto Italian soil without Senate authorization was defined as treason, a crime punishable by death. Caesar's options were clear, and neither was gentle. He could obey the Senate's demands, surrender his command, disband his veterans, and walk back into Rome as a private citizen, where prosecution and political destruction awaited him, or he could march. In his own account of the civil war, Caesar presented the crossing not as ambition but as necessity. The Senate had acted illegally against him. His dignity, his dignitas, the accumulated honour and standing that a Roman nobleman was expected to defend, had been assaulted. His supporters had been threatened. He was not, he argued, making war on the Republic. He was defending himself, and through himself, the Republic, from the tyranny of a faction that had seized the Senate and turned it against the Roman people. And so, at the head of the 13th Legion, he crossed. Alea iacta est, he is reported to have said. The die is cast. The river was behind him, Rome was ahead, and the Republic that had endured Hannibal's crossing of the Alps had survived the invasion of Pyrrhus and 100 foreign enemies across 5 centuries, would now face the most destructive enemy it had ever known. Not a Gaul, not a Carthaginian, not a Parthian king, but a Roman general marching on his own city, at the head of Roman legions, with the ghosts of Pompey and Crassus, and the crumbling architecture of the Triumvirate at his back. Caesar had crossed a line that Roman law had made sacred, transforming what began as a political dispute into an open war, and now the Republic that had survived Hannibal, Pyrrhus, and 100 foreign enemies would face the most destructive enemy it had ever known, itself. Chapter 5: Civil War, Dictatorship, and the Ides of March, Caesar's Rise and Fall. In the early days of January, in the 49th year before the Common Era, a single Roman general stood at the banks of a shallow river in northern Italy, and the world held its breath. The river was called the Rubicon. It was not wide and it was not deep, but it marked something ancient and inviolable, the boundary beyond which no Roman commander was permitted to lead his army. To cross it with legions under arms was to declare war upon the Senate, upon Rome itself, upon centuries of republican tradition. Julius Caesar crossed it anyway. His 13th Legion waded through the cold current in the winter dark, and by morning they had seized the strategic town of Ariminum, the gateway to the Italian heartland. What followed was less a campaign than a tide. Caesar's veterans swept south through Umbria, through Picenum, through Etruria, and town after town opened its gates or simply stepped aside. The Senate, in its alarm, had issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, its most extreme declaration of emergency. Caesar had been named an enemy of the state, but the declaration rang hollow against the disciplined and battle-hardened men who marched beneath his eagles. In Rome, the city trembled, and the man who was supposed to defend it, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey the Great, chose not to stay. Pompey's reasoning was strategic, even if it struck many as abandonment. He understood that meeting Caesar on Italian soil with the forces then available was a gamble he could not afford to lose. The East held something Italy could not offer in those rushed and panicked days: depth. There were provinces rich with grain and silver, legions that could be raised, naval power that stretched across the Mediterranean. Pompey believed that a long war favoured those with the greater resources, and so he withdrew, first to Brundisium in the south, and then across the sea to Greece, taking the consuls and most of the Senate with him. Caesar followed him to Brundisium and seized the port. In a matter of weeks, without a single pitched battle on Italian soil, he had taken the political heart of the Republic. Rome, ancient eternal Rome, was now his. But Caesar did not linger. His mind moved faster than his enemies could anticipate. Before Pompey could consolidate his eastern forces, Caesar turned westward to deal with the Pompeian legions holding Spain. He crossed into Hispania in June, linked up with advance forces, and moved on the fortified town of Ilerda, where the Pompeian commanders Afranius and Petreius had assembled 5 full legions. Spring floods battered Caesar's pontoon bridges. The terrain resisted him, yet through patient manoeuvring and relentless pressure, he forced the Pompeian army into an untenable position and offered them generous terms: disband the legions, leave Spain freely. The commanders accepted. The remaining Pompeian governor, Marcus Varro, surrendered shortly after. All of Spain passed into Caesar's hands without a decisive slaughter. While Caesar moved through those long western campaigns, Rome itself was restless and unmoored. Caesar had left his trusted lieutenant Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, to govern Italy in his absence, granting him the title of Master of the Horse. Antony's tenure was turbulent. When the tribune Dolabella attempted to push through radical debt cancellation measures, Antony suppressed the resulting riots with a harshness that left blood in the streets and resentment in the forum. Caesar would later strip Antony of his official duties for a time, uncomfortable with the chaos his deputy had generated. And yet Antony remained essential, a commander of rare gifts, loyal to Caesar's cause and bound to him in the years still to come. The war, however, was far from settled. Pompey waited in Greece, gathering his strength. His army had grown formidable. Some accounts place his forces at more than 50,000 legionaries, alongside thousands of cavalry and auxiliaries. It was the largest Roman army assembled against another Roman in living memory. The two generals met at last on the 9th day of August in the year 48, near a town in central Greece called Pharsalus. Caesar's army was smaller, perhaps 22 or 23,000 veterans against Pompey's far larger host. But numbers, as Caesar understood better than almost anyone, were not the whole story. His men were disciplined by years of Gallic campaigning. They knew how to read a battle as it shifted and breathed, and Caesar himself possessed an almost uncanny instinct for the decisive moment. When Pompey's superior cavalry swept around Caesar's right flank, they met something unexpected, a hidden reserve of infantry Caesar had placed precisely for that purpose. The charge broke, the cavalry scattered, and then Caesar's front reinforced, wheeled and struck Pompey's exposed left. The larger army, many of them recent recruits unused to the grinding close work of Roman infantry combat, collapsed into a panic-driven rout. Pompey watched his life's work unravel in a single afternoon and fled the field. The civil war was not over, but Pharsalus had decided its shape. Pompey sailed east searching for refuge and settled on Egypt. He had once helped establish the Ptolemaic dynasty's connection to Rome, and he hoped the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII might extend him asylum and the resources to continue the fight. Instead, the Egyptian court, dominated by advisors who feared Caesar's wrath and saw an opportunity to buy his favour, ordered Pompey killed as he stepped ashore. The great general who had once triumphed 3 times over 3 continents was murdered on a small boat in the shallows of an Egyptian beach. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Whether from grief or from the loss of the chance to show clemency to a once great rival, history does not entirely say. But Egypt brought Caesar something unexpected. The Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, had been driven from her throne by her younger brother Ptolemy XIII and his powerful regents. She found her way to Caesar. One ancient account describes her being smuggled into his presence wrapped in a carpet, and the two formed an alliance that was both political and deeply personal. Caesar supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and what followed was the Alexandrian War, a dangerous, grinding siege in which Caesar and his small force were trapped in the palace quarter of Alexandria, fighting off the Egyptian royal army while awaiting reinforcement. Naval battles erupted in the harbour, supply lines were cut, the threat of assassination hung in the corridors of the palace. It was a precarious, intimate, and almost surreal chapter. The master of the Roman world, bottled up in a foreign city, fighting for his survival while conducting an affair with a queen. Relief eventually came in the form of a Roman army marching from Syria. Ptolemy XIII fled the battlefield that followed and drowned in the Nile during his attempted escape. Cleopatra was installed as queen. Their union would produce a son, Ptolemy XV, whom later generations would call Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar moved on. There was always somewhere else demanding his attention. In Africa, the remnants of the Pompeian senatorial faction had regrouped under the command of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio and the philosopher-statesman Cato the Younger. On the 6th of April in the year 46, Caesar met them at Thapsus. The battle was decisive. The Optimate army broke, and Cato, the man who perhaps more than any other embodied the old republican ideals, the Stoic virtues, the incorruptible opposition to concentrated power, refused to surrender. He took his own life at Utica rather than submit to a Caesar pardon he considered an insult to his dignity and to the republic he had served. Cato's death echoed far beyond the battlefield. He became a symbol, a martyr for those who believed that Rome's ancient freedoms had died alongside him. His memory would haunt the centuries that followed. The war had one final theatre. In Spain, the sons of Pompey, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised new legions and were threatening to reopen the Western Front. Caesar crossed into Hispania once more, and on the 17th of March in the year 45, he met them at a place called Munda. Munda was different from all his other battles. The Pompeian commanders held the high ground behind a stream and marshy slope, and their legions were not raw recruits. They were seasoned Roman veterans who had learned their craft under the same generals as Caesar's own men. Caesar's soldiers were forced to advance uphill under heavy fire, fighting in exhausting close combat that left no room for clever manoeuvre. Caesar himself went to the front line to steady his men, exposing himself to enemy weapons in a way that shocked even his hardened soldiers. The battle was won at last. But Caesar afterwards said something those who knew him long remembered, that he had fought many battles for victory, but at Munda he had fought for his life. The civil wars were over, and now came the question that Rome had been quietly dreading. What would Caesar do with what he had won? The answer came in layers, accumulating title by title, honour by honour. He had first been appointed dictator back in 49, a traditional emergency office meant to be temporary. By the early weeks of February in 44, the Senate granted him something the Roman Republic had never before sanctioned: the title of Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in perpetuity, Dictator for life. The office had once existed to save the Republic in moments of crisis. Now it had become something else entirely. The honours multiplied in ways that made thoughtful senators grow still and quiet. Caesar's portrait appeared on coins while he still breathed, a thing previously unthinkable for a living Roman. He sat on a gilded throne in the Senate chamber. His statues were placed in temples alongside the gods. 24 lictors accompanied him, their fasces bearing the axe even within the city boundary, the ancient symbol of power over life and death. The month of his birth, Quintilis, was renamed in his honour, Julius, the month we still call July. And yet Caesar was not merely accumulating symbols of power. He was also governing, and governing with energy and imagination. He reformed the old Roman calendar, introducing the solar-based Julian calendar of 365 days with a leap year every 4 years, an innovation that the Western world would use for over 15 centuries. He passed legislation to ease the burden of debt. He founded veteran colonies at Carthage and Corinth, giving his soldiers land and giving Rome 2 rebuilt cities in places of ancient consequence. He expanded the Senate from 600 to 900 members, rewarding allies and widening the circle of Roman governance. He restructured the courts and reorganized provincial administration, extending citizenship and civic rights to new communities. These were not the acts of a man who had simply seized power for its own sake, but they were the acts of a man who no longer believed the old institutions could function without his hand guiding them. And that belief, however practically grounded, was precisely what terrified the men who still loved the Republic. On the 15th of February, 44, at the ancient festival of Lupercalia, the tension took its most theatrical form. Mark Antony, serving as consul, publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem, the band of cloth that in the Hellenistic East marked a king. Caesar pushed it away. The crowd cheered. Antony offered it again. Caesar refused again. A third time, and again he refused, declaring that only Jupiter was king of the Romans. It was a performance, and everyone in the forum knew it. But the performance satisfied no one. Caesar's supporters, who had hoped the moment might legitimize his supreme authority, saw only a missed opportunity. His senatorial opponents saw only confirmation of what they already feared, that the diadem was coming one way or another, and that Caesar was simply waiting for the right moment to accept it. Somewhere in the weeks that followed, the conspiracy solidified. Its centre was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man of ancient lineage, born of the same family that had centuries earlier expelled the kings from Rome. He was the son of Servilia, once Caesar's lover, and Caesar had treated him with particular warmth and trust. After Pharsalus, Brutus had defected from Pompey's cause, been forgiven, and given high office. He was learned, deliberate, and deeply bound to Stoic philosophy and republican ideals. His wife Portia was the daughter of Cato the Younger. The weight of his ancestry and his principles pressed heavily upon him. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a veteran military commander and a man of sharper personal ambitions, had watched the erosion of senatorial authority with growing bitterness. He understood that Brutus's name and reputation were essential to give the conspiracy moral legitimacy, and he pressed his brother-in-law to join. The group that gathered around them numbered perhaps 60 senators. Among them were Publius Servilius Casca, who would strike the first blow. Lucius Tillius Cimber, who would create the distraction, Gaius Trebonius, who would keep Antony occupied and away from the chamber, and dozens of others whose motivations blended genuine republican principle with personal grievance, wounded pride and ambition. Some had been passed over for honours, some resented Caesar's domination of the political landscape, some feared what a formal monarchy would mean for men of their class. They chose the 15th of March, a day the Roman calendar marked as the Ides. The Senate was meeting not in its usual chamber, but in the Curia of Pompey, within the theatre of Pompey. The setting carried its own quiet irony. Caesar came despite warnings. There had been omens reported, a soothsayer's caution, and his wife Calpurnia had begged him not to go. He dismissed the concerns and entered the chamber. What followed was swift and terrible. The conspirators gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Lucius Tillius Cimber grasped Caesar's toga to hold him in place. Casca struck first, a blow to the neck. Caesar grabbed for the blade, and then the others closed in. 23 wounds. The accounts agree on that number. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, and the senators who had not been part of the plot fled in terror through the halls of the theatre, spilling out into the streets of a city that did not yet know what had just happened. Mark Antony, kept away from the chamber by Gaius Trebonius, learned of the assassination and fled the city, disguising himself to avoid the conspirators' blades. The assassins emerged into the forum, waving their bloody daggers and calling out that Rome was free. The people of the city heard them and retreated behind locked doors. In the days that followed, a reading of Caesar's will revealed his final intentions. He named his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his principal heir, adopting him posthumously and passing to him both the family name and the enormous weight of Caesar's political legacy. He also left generous gifts to the Roman people, a sum of money for every citizen, and the use of his personal gardens across the Tiber as public land. Antony had returned to the city, and when he rose before the assembled Roman people to deliver the funeral oration for the slain dictator, he used the will, the wounds, the memory of Caesar's weeping for the poor and his repeated refusal of the crown, to transform a shocked and grieving crowd into something volatile and dangerous. He spoke of the conspirators with elaborate cutting courtesy, calling them honourable men again and again, until the word curdled in the air. He described the wounds on Caesar's body. He read the will aloud. The crowd did not need to be told what to feel. The fury came of its own accord. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, the republic they had imagined saving, the old balanced republic of magistrates and shared authority and senatorial dignity, showed no sign of returning. Because the truth that the conspirators had refused to see, or could not bear to see, was that the republic had not been undone by Caesar alone. It had been hollowing out for a century, eroded by civil wars and personal armies and political patronage that had long since shifted popular loyalty from institutions to men. Caesar had not broken the Republic. He had simply been the clearest expression of its long deterioration. The senators who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic, but they had misread everything: the city, the legions, the people, and history itself. And from the blood pooling at the base of Pompey's statue, a new struggle was already beginning that would finally and permanently extinguish whatever remained of the Republic they had died to protect. Chapter 6, From Augustus to Empire, the Death of the Republic and the Birth of a New Rome. In the spring of 44 BC, a 19-year-old young man was stationed far from Rome in the coastal city of Apollonia on the Adriatic shore, preparing for a military campaign into Parthia. His name was Gaius Octavius, and he was, by the measure of the Roman world, still quite young, the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, the son of a respectable equestrian family, a boy who had accompanied the dictator on campaign in Spain and had proven himself attentive and capable. He could not yet have known what was coming, and then, carried across the water by the messengers whose voices must have trembled, the news arrived. Julius Caesar was dead, murdered on the floor of the Senate on the Ides of March. What Octavian felt in those first quiet hours is not something the ancient sources have preserved in full, but what he did next tells something of the man he was already becoming. He learned, in those same difficult days, that Caesar had named him as his principal heir in a sealed will, that Caesar had adopted him posthumously, granting him the name Gaius Julius Caesar, granting him 3/4 of a vast estate, and, most importantly of all, the invisible weight of Caesar's legacy and the loyalty of his veterans. Octavian set sail for the Italian coast, arrived at Brundisium, accepted the inheritance, accepted the name, and turned toward Rome. He was 19 years old. Rome was in chaos, and yet he came. The city he returned to was one already reshaping itself around a new and forceful presence. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, had moved quickly in the days after the assassination. He had taken control of Caesar's papers, his treasury, and his political networks, and had positioned himself as the natural successor to Caesar's power. He was older, more experienced, and far more established within the machinery of Roman politics. When the young Octavian arrived to claim his inheritance, Antony refused to relinquish the fortune he'd already absorbed. Octavian was forced to borrow heavily, to call in private debts, to exhaust every resource at his disposal simply to honour the bequest Caesar had promised to the Roman people and to his veterans. The tension between the two men would define the next decade. But before their rivalry could find its full expression, each would first need to prove himself against the fragile and crumbling structure of the Republic itself. In the Senate, a different sort of voice was rising. Cicero, Marcus Tullius. Cicero was one of Rome's most celebrated minds. He had served as consul, had written brilliantly on law and philosophy and the nature of the state, and has spent a long career navigating the dangerous waters of Roman politics with a combination of eloquence and principle that few could match. After Caesar's death, Cicero saw an opportunity to restore what he believed had been taken from Rome, the Republic, with its balances of power, its traditions, its Senate-led governance. He turned his formidable rhetorical gifts toward a new target, Mark Antony. Beginning in September of 44 BC, Cicero delivered a series of 14 speeches against Antony, modelled on the ancient Athenian orations of Demosthenes against the Macedonian king Philip II. He called them the Philippics. In them he painted Antony as a would-be tyrant, a man who wished to shatter the Republic and seize Caesar's throne for himself. He praised the young Octavian as Rome's saviour, the Senate's greatest hope. He urged legal and military action. He managed for a time to have Antony declared an enemy of the state. But Cicero misjudged something essential. He believed that Octavian was a tool, useful for the Senate's purposes and then, presumably, expendable. He did not see, or perhaps could not bring himself to see, that the young man he was praising was already thinking several steps ahead. The war that followed, the Mutina War of 43 BC, saw Octavian fighting alongside the Senate's armies against Antony in northern Italy, helping to win 2 difficult battles near the city of Mutina. But when the 2 consuls who led the Senate's forces were mortally wounded in the fighting, the power vacuum they left behind changed everything. Octavian demanded the consulship. He marched on Rome. He took it. And then, rather than remaining the Senate's loyal instrument, he turned and negotiated with the very man he had just been fighting. In November of 43 BC, on a small island in a river near Bononia, 3 men met and changed the world: Octavian, Mark Antony, and a third general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formalized an alliance that Roman law had never seen before. The Lex Titia created what historians call the Second Triumvirate, not the informal, private agreement that Caesar, Pompey and Crassus had once arranged, but a legal magistracy with official 5-year terms and powers that exceeded anything the Republic had previously granted to any individual. The 3 men could appoint magistrates, enact laws without the Senate's approval, declare war, negotiate peace, and punish enemies without trial. The Republic's carefully balanced architecture built over centuries had, in a single document, been set aside. Almost immediately, the Triumvirate turned its new powers toward the task of elimination. They compiled lists, prescription lists, that named approximately 300 senators and an equal number of equestrians. Those named were hunted, killed, and their properties seized and sold. The proceeds funded the coming war against Caesar's assassins. The process also served a quieter, colder purpose. Enemies disappeared, rivals vanished, and power concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. Cicero's name was on the list. Antony had not forgotten the Philippics. In December of 43 BC, soldiers caught Cicero attempting to flee Italy. He accepted his fate, it is said, with a stillness that the ancient sources record with a kind of reluctant admiration. He was killed. His severed head and hands, the head that had spoken, the hands that had written those scorching speeches, were brought to Rome and displayed on the rostra in the Forum, the very platform from which he had once addressed the Roman people. It was a statement of a new kind of power, and those who saw it understood what it meant. With Rome secured behind them, the Triumvirate moved east. Brutus and Cassius, the most prominent of Caesar's assassins, had spent the months since the Ides of March building an army in the eastern provinces, drawing legions and resources from Macedonia and the surrounding territories. They called themselves the Liberators. In the autumn of 42 BC, 2 vast armies met on the plain near the city of Philippi in northern Greece. The twin battles of Philippi unfolded over 3 weeks. In the first engagement, the lines of both sides broke in different places at the same moment. Brutus drove Octavian's forces into retreat and seized their camp, while Antony simultaneously shattered Cassius's position and overran his. Cassius, hearing a false report that Brutus too had failed and unable to bear the prospect of defeat, took his own life. The second battle came 3 weeks later. Brutus's line was broken, his centre overwhelmed. He retreated into the hills and then, alone in the darkness, he too fell on his sword. The Republic's last committed defenders were gone. The years that followed were a period of exhausting, overlapping conflict, as the 3 men who had divided the Roman world between them slowly turned against one another. Lepidus, the quietest of the 3, was gradually moved aside, assigned minor provinces, stripped of meaningful authority, and eventually, after a failed attempt to seize Sicily following the defeat of Sextus Pompeius in 36 BC, banished to a remote exile. He kept the ceremonial title of Pontifex Maximus, but nothing more. Sextus Pompeius was himself a figure of considerable power during these years. The younger son of Pompey the Great, who had built a formidable navy and controlled Sicily and the western sea lanes, blocking grain shipments to Rome and winning a significant naval engagement against Octavian's forces. He was eventually defeated at the Battle of Naulochus in 36 BC by Octavian's gifted admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, and later captured and executed in Asia Minor. The Perusian War of 41 and 40 BC offered a glimpse of the tensions that still ran beneath the surface of the Triumvirate's formal unity. Antony's brother Lucius, backed by Antony's wife Fulvia, gathered forces in Italy and challenged Octavian's authority over land distribution and the settlement of veterans. Octavian's army laid siege to the city of Perusia, forcing Lucius to surrender. A temporary peace was restored through the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC, which divided the Roman world more clearly between Antony in the east and Octavian in the west, and sealed with a marriage between Antony and Octavian's sister Octavia. But it was a surface calm stretched thin over a deepening divide. In the east, Antony had found something more than a military alliance. His relationship with Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, had begun as a strategic partnership, each needing what the other could provide, but it became something more personal, more publicly visible, and ultimately more politically dangerous. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children. The Roman world watched, and in Rome, Octavian watched most carefully of all. In the autumn of 34 BC, Antony staged an event in Alexandria that would prove decisive in the propaganda war between the two men. The Donations of Alexandria, as historians have called it, was a ceremony in which Antony distributed vast territories, Roman provinces among them, to Cleopatra and their children, crowning them with titles of kingship and declaring Cleopatra herself Queen of Kings. He recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the legitimate heir to Caesar's legacy, a direct challenge to Octavian's own claim to that inheritance. Octavian responded with a campaign not of armies but of words. He portrayed Antony as a Roman who had surrendered himself to an Eastern queen, who had abandoned his Roman wife, forgotten his Roman gods, embraced foreign rites, and planned, so the story went, to move Rome's capital to Alexandria itself. He obtained Antony's will from the Temple of Vesta and read its contents aloud to the Senate, revealing that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria and had named Cleopatra's children as his heirs. Whether the reading was entirely accurate or selectively presented, its effect was powerful. The Senate stripped Antony of his offices and declared war, not on Antony himself, for that would have been civil war openly named, but on Cleopatra and Egypt. By the summer of 31 BC, 2 enormous forces faced each other near the western coast of Greece. On the promontory of Actium, at the entrance to the Gulf of Ambracia, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, perhaps 500 warships large and heavily armed, sat opposite Octavian's more manoeuvrable galleys under Agrippa's command. A prolonged blockade had already worn down Antony's morale and supply lines. When the battle came on the 2nd of September, Antony's larger ships found themselves outmaneuvered. Agrippa's vessels employed grappling devices to seize and disable the heavier quinqueremes. As the battle turned against him, Cleopatra's squadron withdrew toward Egypt. Antony followed. The remaining fleet was captured or destroyed. They sailed to Alexandria, but the city they returned to was already beginning to slip away. Antony's army deserted. Octavian's forces advanced. In August of 30 BC, with no path remaining, Antony took his own life, stabbed himself, and died, it is recorded, in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra, refusing to be displayed as a captive in Octavian's triumph, took her own life shortly after, tradition saying by the bite of an asp, though the exact means remains unknown. She was approximately 39 years old. The last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was gone. Egypt passed into Roman hands, governed not as a senatorial province but as a personal possession of Octavian, administered by an equestrian prefect answerable only to him, its grain and its wealth flowing directly into the new order's foundations. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. 3 triumphs, in fact, were celebrated. And then, in the year 27 BC, something curious happened. Something that would define the next 5 centuries of the Roman world. Octavian appeared before the Senate and announced his intention to restore the Republic. he offered to lay down his extraordinary powers. The Senate, whether from genuine gratitude or the quiet understanding of who held the legions, declined. They begged him to remain. They gave him the title Augustus, a word meaning something close to the sacred, the revered, the elevated. They confirmed his authority over the armed provinces, his proconsular imperium, his control of foreign policy, and in 23 BC, a permanent grant of tribunitian power for life. Augustus, for Octavian was now Augustus, and would remain so until his death, carefully preserved the outward forms of the Republic. The Senate met, magistrates were elected, assemblies gathered, the old titles remained. But the power behind those forms had shifted irrevocably. Augustus controlled the armies. Augustus governed the most important provinces through his own appointed legates. Augustus could veto any act of any magistrate, could propose or block any legislation, could intervene in any corner of the Roman world. The Senate and the people of Rome retained the language of the Republic while living quietly and without dramatic rupture within an empire. Scholars have long debated how to name what Augustus did. Was he a revolutionary who dismantled the Republic and replaced it with autocracy dressed in republican clothing? Or was he a conservative who preserved enough of the old forms to ensure continuity and stability, reconfiguring rather than destroying? Ronald Syme, writing in the 20th century, called it a Roman revolution, a fundamental transformation of power, however carefully veiled. Others have pointed to the genuine continuity of institutions, the real functioning of the Senate, the preservation of law, and argued that Augustus was less a destroyer than a transformer. The debate has never fully resolved, which is perhaps itself part of the answer. Augustus understood that Romans needed to believe they still lived in a republic, and he gave them that belief, while holding the substance of power entirely in his own hands. Looking back across the centuries, past the legions and the civil wars, past the proscription lists and the severed heads on the rostra, past the burning ambitions and the quiet betrayals, historians have traced the Republic's dissolution not to a single moment but to a long accumulation of pressures, the Gracchi brothers, who exposed the land inequalities that rotted the Republic's foundations. Marius, whose military reforms untethered the army from the state and bound it instead to individual commanders. Sulla, who marched his legions into Rome itself and demonstrated, in an act that history could not undemonstrate, that a general could use his army to seize power. Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon and declared himself dictator for life. Each step made the next step easier. Each precedent lowered the threshold for the one that followed. And beneath all of it ran the deeper question that Rome's expansion had forced into the open. Could a city-state's constitution govern a Mediterranean empire? Could institutions designed for a community of a few thousand citizens, institutions built on personal relationships, seasonal elections, and senatorial consensus, bear the weight of hundreds of provinces, millions of subjects, and armies stationed at the edges of the known world? The evidence of history suggests they could not. The strains were too great, the contradictions too deep, the old guardrails too fragile against the pressure of wealth, ambition, and military power. Later ages would look to Rome for lessons. Political thinkers across centuries would point to the Republic's fall as a warning that economic inequality left unreformed will destabilize even the most established governance. That political violence, once normalized, becomes difficult to contain. That institutions depend not just on their written forms, but on the willingness of citizens and leaders alike to observe and enforce their spirit. That the trade of liberty for stability, however appealing in a moment of fear or exhaustion, carries a long price. Augustus lived for another 40 years after the settlement of 27 BC. dying at last in 14 AD at the age of 75, having presided over a transformation so gradual and so carefully managed that many Romans never quite registered the moment it had fully completed. The old words were still spoken, the old rituals were still observed, the old buildings still stood, and so the republic that had conquered the ancient world did not fall in a single catastrophic moment, but dissolved slowly, like an inscription worn smooth by wind and rain until no one could read what it had once said, leaving behind a world shaped by its memory but governed by its opposite.